Good evening, everybody. Today is October the 12th, as according to the old calendar, I am Reader Lazar. Welcome to Voice of British Orthodoxy. I hope you all have had a very wonderful day today. So today we have 4 entries that are basically the same, but for whatever reason, the Celtic Saints website has, Ethel Dreader down for today, but don't worry about that. Anyway, so our first entry for today is going to be Saint, I believe it's pronounced Fiacc, or Fiacc, and he is from the 5th century. A friend of disciple of St. Patrick, 7th of November. St. Fiacc was a bishop of unknown see in Ireland. He is the author... He is the author of a still extant hymn in honour of St. Patrick, and he has a Troparion in tone 1, as we can see from the, Thou didst receive, thou didst devote thy life and ministry to missionary endeavour, O holy Hierarch Fiacc, and art remembered as the hymnographer who honoured the great Patrick. Together with him thou didst drive out of Ireland the ignorance and error of paganism. Pray that Christ our God will raise up our noble souls in our day, who will restore the Orthodox faith to the island of saints, and advance the kingdom of God for the salvation of the souls. And the group chat entry is Saint Fiacc, also known as Fiacc and Fiacc, a bishop in Ireland, friend and disciple of St. Patrick, in whose honour we wrote a hymn which still exists. 5th century, St. Fiacc founded the church of Domnach Fiacc and also a church at Sletty. Our next saint of the day is going to be Saint Moby, also known as Moby Clarineck or Berchan, of Glasnevin, and he is from the 6th century. Saint Moby of Glasnevin is one of the 12 apostles of Ireland. Colgan calls him Berchan, and he says he was a relative of Saint Brigid of Kildare, who we will commemorate on the 1st of February. In his Insula Sanctorum et Doctorum, Roman Catholic Archbishop John Healy describes Saint Moby as a great master of the spiritual life. Saint Moby was the founding abbot of Glasnevin Monastery in County Dublin, just north of present-day Dublin city centre. At its height, there were about 50 students at Glasnevin, including Saints Columba, who we commemorate back on the 9th of June, Comgall, who we commemorate back on the 10th of May, Kieran, who we commemorated on the 14th of June, and Kenneth, who we commemorated yesterday on the 11th of October. In 544, a plague came through the area and the students dispersed to various parts of Ireland. St. Moby succumbed to the plague and reposed 12th of October 544. With his last breath, St. Moby blessed St. Columba to found the School of Derry. This entry for the 12th of October is in the Fili Wenguso. Declare Fiacc and Fiacre at the same time. Great is that treasure. Moby, strong that triumph. That fair flat-faced one. Clarineck means flat-faced in Irish Gaelic. According to tradition, St. Moby was born without eyes or a nose, and was miraculously cured when he splashed the baptismal waters of St. David of Wales, who we commemorated back on the 1st of March, on his face 3 times. The Martyrology of Donegal commemorates him, Moby Clarineck, abbot of Glasnevin in Fingal, on the brink of the river Liffey, on the north side, and Berchan was another name for him. Soon after his repose, St. Moby was recognised as a saint by his disciples. Today there is a Church of Ireland parish in Glasnevin named for St. Moby. The group chat entry says Moby of Glasnevin, the same nicknames in brackets as in the book. One of the 12 apostles of Ireland, 544. His surname means flat-faced in Irish, a reference to his being born without eyes or a nose, a condition attributed to him being conceived and brought forth from a dead woman. He is said to have been miraculously cured of this deformity when he splashed the baptismal water of St. David on his face 3 times. St. Moby was a significant teacher of monasticism, running a school in Glasnevin, where he tutored many influential Irish saints, including Columba, Canis, also known as Cainach or Kenneth, Comgall, and Kieran. Okay, let's... he is the one saint that isn't actually in the Celtic saints thing, so do with that what you will. So our next entry is depicted on the left on the screen, and it is Saint Edwin, realm martyr of Northumbria. He has an icon made by Uncut Mountain, which is where this icon is from. He is also known as Edwin and Edwini, and he is from the 7th century. The holy, glorious, victorious martyr and right-believing King Edwin of Northumbria was born c. 584, the son of Aela, king of Daria, the southern part of Northumbria. While the primary authority on the life of St. Edwin is St. Bede the Venerable, who we commemorated back on the 25th of May, Historia Ecclesiastica. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is a source of significant material as well. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, upon the death of Aela, Daria was seized by one Ethelric, the identity of whom is uncertain. Presumably he was king of Bernicia, the northern part of Northumbria. He immediately merged Bernicia and Daria into a single kingdom of Northumbria and banished St. Edwin from the kingdom. The location of his early exile is unknown, though according to the accounts of Reginald of Durham and Geoffrey of Monmouth, later traditions place St. Edwin in the kingdom of Gwynedd. It is known that he later took refuge in North Wales, then Mercia, and finally East Anglia under the protection of its king Raedwald. According to St. Bede the Venerable, Ethelric enticed Raedwald to assassinate St. Edwin. Whilst Raedwald was agreeable, his wife had a divine vision that told her to dissuade Raedwald, which she successfully did. In 616, Raedwald defeated the Northumbrian king in battle near the River Idle in present-day Nottinghamshire, and restored St. Edwin to the throne of Northumbria. This effectively confirmed Raedwald as Bretwalda, a king who was also an overlord of some or all of the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The first use is recorded in the 9th century Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. A king up until that point was, in brackets, the sentence starting with a king up until Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was in brackets. In league with Raedwald, St. Edwin expanded his realm to include the minor kingdom of Elmet, and following Raedwald's death in 624, St. Edwin's power was such that he was able to annex the significantly larger kingdom of Lindsey. Though many sources describe St. Edwin as an able ruler, based on the historical record, St. Bede the Venerable's portrayal of him as a rather indecisive and is undoubtedly more accurate. In 625, St. Edwin married St. Ethelbert, who we commemorated back on the 8th of September, the daughter of England's first Christian king, St. Ethelbert of Kent, who we will commemorate on the 25th of February. St. Ethelbert was accompanied by Northumbria by her chaplain, St. Paulinus of York, who we will commemorate on the 10th of October. And though St. Edwin didn't initially convert, he did not obstruct Saints Ethelbert and Paulinus as they preached the faith, and allowed his daughter Enfled to be baptized. St. Bede the Venerable's account of St. Edwin's conversion relates to events which were seemingly pivotal. The first being that St. Paulinus is said to have saved St. Edwin's life whilst the latter was in exile. And the second was following an attempt on his own life by an agent of Quichelm of Wessex at Pascha 626. St. Edward promised to convert if he prevailed in his retaliatory attack against Wessex. His victory made him the most powerful monarch in England, and following catechesis by St. Paulinus, he was baptized, however not without first seeking the advice of his counsellors and obtaining their approval. This leads St. Bede the Venerable to paint St. Edwin as an indecisive king, unwilling to take risks and unable to decide whether to convert or not. At the same time, we must not ignore the undoubted influence of St. Edwin's half Merovingian queen, and it is unlikely the letters from Pope Boniface V to St. Edwin, which St. Bede the Venerable includes in his account, are sui generis. St. Bede the Venerable records the baptism of St. Edward and his chieftains as taking place on the 12th of April, 627. He further claims that St. Edwin's fervour led to the conversion of Raedwell's son, Eorpwald. Following his baptism, St. Edwin appointed St. Paulinus Bishop of York and commenced the building of a stone church there. However, his plans were thwarted by the invasion of Northumbria by Penda of Mercia and his ally, Caedwalla of Gwynedd. The two armies met at Hatfield Chase, near present-day Doncaster, South Yorkshire, on the 12th of October, 633, resulting in the rout of the Northumbrians and St. Edwin's death. Northumbria was once again divided into separate realms of Daria and Bernicia, both of which reverted to paganism. According to legend, following St. Edwin's repose, his body was hidden for a while in Sherwood Forest, at a location that became the village of Edwinstowe, St. Edwin's resting place. His final resting place was at Whitby, apart from his head, which was enshrined at York. Following his repose, St. Edwin was quickly venerated as a saint, and most early English calendars list him as a martyr. His cult was ultimately overshadowed by that of St. Oswald, who we commemorated back on the 5th of September, who was also killed 642 at Hatfield Chase in battle against Penda and Caedwalla. The similar circumstances of their dead led both to being perceived as martyrs. However, St. Bede the Venerable makes it clear that he unreservedly regarded St. Oswald as a saintly figure, a status which in his opinion was not applicable to St. Edwin. I'm going to read the group chat entry, then I will read the Troparion for him. St. Edwin, martyr of Northumbria, king of Northumbria, 638 AD in brackets. In 616, he became king of Northumbria in England, married St. Ethelbert of Kent, and was baptized by St. Paulinus in 627 AD. He fell in battle at Hatfield Chase, fighting against pagan Mercians, and is venerated as a martyr. He was one of the first English kings to convert to Orthodoxy. Tone 4. So, St. Edwin's Troparion is Tone 4. Having accepted the true faith, O righteous Edwin, thou was found worthy to exchange thy worldly crown for the crown of martyrdom at the hands of the godless Mercians. Inspired by thy example, we beseech thee to pray that we may have the courage to fight evil in any form, that we too may receive the reward of eternal blessedness. I will quickly show that for you right here. So I will copy and paste that for you all. Okay, so the thingy website doesn't actually have St. Winifred's Troparia, but I'm pretty sure... Oh wait, no. Okay, never mind. Forgive me. He doesn't even have a Troparion in here. Okay, that makes a little bit more sense. If I find one on any other site, or if I find any extra bonus stuff, I'll obviously leave that in the description for you all, but Right, our final entry for today is Saint Wilfrid, also known as Walafridus and Wilfurda, and he is from the 8th century. A cosmopolitan churchman, noble missionary, and a great defender of papal authority, and one of the most celebrated and controversial bishops of the Anglo-Saxon Church. The son of a Northumbrian Thegan, he entered Lindisfarne in his teens. He soon grew discontent with the Celtic practices of Lindisfarne and sought to expand his knowledge, especially of the Roman practices. With that goal in mind, St. Wilfrid spent time at Canterbury and Rome, returning via Lyon, where he spent 3 years, receiving monastic tonsure according to the Roman practice. Upon his return to Britain, St. Wilfrid was made abbot of the newly founded monastery at Ripon, where he introduced the rule of St. Benedict, which followed the Roman practices. St. Wilfrid served as the chief spokesman at the Synod of Whitby, where his erudition served him well, and as a result, he was able to persuade the council to adopt the Roman practices. So impressive was St. Wilfrid at the council that he was elevated to the See of York. However, St. Wilfrid declined to be consecrated by the northern bishops who followed the Celtic practices, hence he considered them schismatics. St. Wilfrid travelled to France, where he was consecrated by 12 Frankish bishops at Compiègne. For reasons no longer known, his sojourn in France was longer than anticipated, and in his absence, St. Chad, who we commemorated back on the 2nd of March, was appointed Bishop of York in his place. Upon his return to Britain in 666, St. Wilfrid, in his great humility, accepted St. Chad as bishop and retired to Ripon. A few years, St. Theodore of Canterbury, I assume that means a few years later, is meant to say a few years later, but anyway, St. Theodore of Canterbury, who was commemorated him back on the 19th of September, visited Northumbria, where he found St. Chad serving as bishop. He pointed out to him the effects of his position, and at St. Theodore's instigation, St. Chad withdrew, and St. Wilfrid was finally installed as Bishop of York in 669. During his tenure as bishop, St. Wilfrid acted with great vigour, enforcing the Roman practice against the Celtic monks. He completely rebuilt the minster at York and founded churches and monasteries. Not a decade later, St. Theodore divided the Diocese of York into 3 sees, without St. Wilfrid's consent. St. Wilfrid departed for Rome to protest this single-handed act, spending a year preaching in Frisia on the way. Though he prevailed in his appeal, on his return to England he was imprisoned and then exiled to Sussex, where he carried out successful missionary work. 681 to 686. St. Wilfrid and St. Theodore reconciled in 686, and St. Wilfrid was reinstated to the See of York, which he held for about 5 years before disputes with King Ealdhrift compelled him to flee again. St. Wilfrid was then invited by the King of Mercia to administer the vacant See of Lichfield. In 703, a synod called by St. Brithwold, who we will commemorate on the 9th of January, the then Archbishop of Canterbury, decreed that St. Wilfrid should resign his see and retire to Ripon. Once more, St. Wilfrid appealed to Rome. Although he was completely vindicated, he agreed to resign in favour of St. John of Beverley, who we commemorated on the 7th of May, accepting instead the See of Hexham. St. Wilfrid spent the last years of his life in his monastery at Ripon, reposing 709. St. Wilfrid's feast is also listed on the calendar of the Moscow Patriarchate on the 24th of April. I need to get the entry from the group chat up for you. St. Wilfrid, Bishop of York and Confessor, 709 AD in brackets. Born in Ripon in England, he became a monk at Lindisfarne, and after a short stay in Canterbury, he went to France and Rome. And then in brackets it says between 653 and 657. On his return to Northumbria, he found the monastery of Ripon, and in 668 he played a leading part in the Council of Whitby. The rest of his life was occupied with his journeys and missionary works among the Frisians and in Sussex. that is, I believe that is it as far as saints of today go. I will put those saints into the. I will put any Troparions that I do find. I will obviously look up Saint Edwin of Northumbria, see what OCA's website says for him, etc. Etc. I hope you will have a wonderful day tomorrow. God bless you all, and Amen.